Thank you. I was going to start with this kind of ledger sheet approach because I think that's what usually is done with basic income. You say, well, there's this one on one side, this is a debit, one side, this is a credit. See if you can kind of get them, well, get the credit side to balance out better. I'm not going to go through the 2 or 3 slides on that, except to make one point to give you from a trade union perspective, and that's where I come from, as to why basic income is potentially very beneficial and potentially problematic. And it's the one slide that I didn't actually put up. I mean, it just got lost somewhere. First off, there is the argument, I think it's a credible argument, that if everyone has a basic income, that people then can decide to avoid highly exploitative jobs. And we think of that as kind of precarious jobs, jobs that don't pay well, jobs where the working conditions are terrible, and that therefore that would, in one sense, force employers to up their game. And I think there's a lot for that. In other words, it would strengthen the workers' bargaining power. We can have a theoretical discussion about whether you can do that as an individual or collectively. That's all very interesting. But it could do that. However, the concern from the trade union point of view, and I think it's a valid one, is that if you have a basic income, you could end up depressing wages at the lower end, and to the extent that taxation rises at the higher end for those professionals or for those with high skills, they would then be more successful in pushing up the wages to avoid the tax increase, and that therefore you would have widening wage inequality and depression of wages at the low and middle income, possibly at the middle income levels. And I think there's something to both, and that's the problem. But I think this should caution us that basic income is not just about saying we're going to take a little bit from this section, and we're going to take a little bit of that section, and then we're going to put it into here, and that's going to make the thing kind of work in mathematical terms. Things like basic income are actually put into a social situation where there is power relationships. And that will determine how basic income actually unfolds. And we can define those power relationships as, the 1% versus the 99, labor versus capital. We can term in terms of gender, ecological, race, whatever those power relationships might be, their basic income will be molded by those power relationships, and therefore it's not just a technical exercise. I want to focus on 2 things before getting into a discussion of how possibly basic income can create a dynamic relationship with other transformative strategies. First off, I don't think it's any surprise. There have been some studies done here in the Republic that shows that basic income would be very expensive and would require a very high tax rate. A recent attempt to model the cost in the UK by Reed and Lansley found the cost to be prohibitive, and there would still be substantial losers in the bottom deciles because of the elimination of means-tested programs. Opportunity costs would be potentially high. Spending on public services needs to increase by over 10 billion euros already just to reach the EU average. Therefore, one could argue that anything taken from that ability to fund our public services at the European level would be a cost. And there could be considerable deadweight costs. If in the first instance your priority is to eliminate poverty, then there are probably less expensive ways to do that than a basic income. But I think probably the biggest objection to basic income, or I should say the biggest objection to be overcome by proponents of basic income, happens to be the very reasons that proponents actually argue for basic income, and that is because it represents this transformation, this systemic break in the way we engage in jobs, work, and social activity. And I would suggest to you that people are systemic break shy, which is why most systemic breaks actually occur externally. We think of war, we think of natural catastrophes, we think of kind of meltdowns in the economies like the Great Depression. They're usually imposed externally and not brought on willingly. Now, because there are some things that can be dealt with, like whether it's Irish Water or the High Court striking down of joint labor committees, which was an attack on the low paid, they can actually be rectified. They can be actually reversed because they're not systemic. systemically problematic. That cannot be said of basic income. So if you were to introduce it, and then you find that you've worked up all that thing to get the systemic break, and it's not really working out the way you thought it would be, and who knows how such a transformative strategy would work out, then it's harder to undo it and reverse the process. It becomes even more costly. So that's why there is there's a tendency to kind of avoid those things. Now, none of this is saying that basic income is a bad idea. I actually think it's a good idea. It has the potential to advance economic freedom, social security, personal autonomy, and to move along the agenda of the decommodification of labor. However, I think this calls for, because of these issues, and there are some of the issues, it's the undermining of social protection, labor market distortions, costs. I think this calls for feasible transitional strategies. But not only that, maybe we should also consider in the debate that basic income does not have to do all the heavy lifting to achieve those potential things of freedom and autonomy and decommodification. It doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting. It can actually create a dynamic relationship with other transformative strategies that are seeking to do the same thing, that actually come from that same type of narrative. If basic income would do it, were to do that, then it would unequivocally position itself in the progressive sphere and therefore be in a position to ally with those forces that want to make it a truly emancipatory situation and not something where right now the balance of power in society would suggest it might be otherwise. I want to look at just quickly two similar transformative strategies. The first one is reduction of the working week. The first demand of the trade union movement in the 19th century was not pay rises. It was a reduction of the working week from 60 hours to 40 hours. And when you read the arguments that they had back then, it was amazing. They saw this as a transformative experience. We're so used to the 8 hours sleep, 8 hours work, 8 hours play thing. We forget what it was like to work 60 hours in conditions that we cannot conceive of, So when they talked about those extra hours, they talked about it enhancing the dignity of the individual. They talked about education, time for civic participation, time to be involved in a trade union, to transform the individual. I suggest that we, and especially the trade union movement, should go back to that transformative goal. And we're starting to become an issue. People are starting to talk about the 30 hours work week. They're doing that because of issues like workplace stress, commuting times, work-life balance, mental health, and of course, the fact is, reduced per unit productivity. I can tell you, what does my employer get out of me at 4 o'clock on a Friday? Squat. Listen, human beings are forward-looking, and Friday at 4 o'clock, there's only one thing you look forward to. The problem is that reducing the working week would be economically very challenging. Just a slide rule exercise, and not dynamic, but an average firm would require a 30% increase in employment or labor costs, if you like to use that word, terrible word. Labor is not a cost, it's a creator of wealth, but nonetheless, you get what I mean. Just to maintain output, 30%. Capital-dense sectors could probably afford that. But labor-dense sectors, which most people work in, by the way, whether it's retail, hospitality, health, education, that would either require that costs are recouped by the employer through suppressing wages and working conditions, passing in costs on to the consumers, or in the case of the public sector, avoiding certain services or increasing taxation. And the fact is, right now, there are a few proposals for concrete proposals for doing the working week. Nonetheless, I think it's one of those strategies that is worth pursuing. Imagine a 6-hour working day. Imagine every weekend a 3-day weekend. Imagine every month 1 week off. Or imagine every year a 10 to 12 week holiday. Works for me. But it can only happen with a supporting strategy. Social insurance, how much time do I have left, Mick?
No,
Okay.
it's time, keep going.
Last year, RT had this program, and it compared people's living standards in France, a household in France and a household in Ireland. And in France, they found that childcare and early childhood education is free and universal. GP visits cost only €7. Unemployed workers receive 80% of their previous pay for over a year in unemployment benefit, and hospital waiting times were measured in hours and days rather than weeks and months. And of course, the discussion went back to the panel, and they said, oh, wow, this is great. Oh, geez, that must be fantastic. But the Irish would never pay the taxes necessary to achieve that. What they didn't know is that Irish workers pay a higher effective personal tax rate than the French workers. That's what they didn't realize. So how did the French do it? How do other EU countries do it? Social wage. Social wage. We have very little appreciation of the role of social insurance that drives social protection and public services in other European countries. In Europe, over 40% of government expenditure occurs through social insurance. Here, it's less than 10%. I just want to say this, and this is a thing that probably will be discussed later today, and in a lot of models for financing basic income. Employer social insurance is part of employees' compensation and part of an employee's wage packet. I get a wage directly into my pocket, and I can go out and consume it, I can save it, I can invest it. That's my wage in my pocket. But my employer pays a proportion of my total wage into a social insurance fund or some other fund, and there I can access in-work benefits, or I can consume services collectively, such as free or low-cost health. Employer social insurance is not a tax that funds the exchequer. It is part of workers' pay package. And one of the problems is the reason why we don't have the social protection and public services that they have in Europe and other European countries is our social wage is so low. It would have to more than double just to reach the average of other European countries. It would have to more than treble to reach the French. That's why they can afford all those things. Social insurance has a much greater capacity to mobilize resources for people in times of need than basic income. That's just a mathematical fact. If I am unemployed under a basic income regime, I would just get basic income. But under a proper social insurance regime, I get 70, 80% of my previous wage. Same thing if I become sick. If I'm not covered by a sick pay at work, most private sector workers aren't, then I would just get the basic income. But under pay-related sickness benefit, I get 80, 90% of my pay in that. Same thing with maternity benefits. Same thing with old age payments, which means I wouldn't have to go to the private pension industry and hope that the fund managers can do the business to ensure my retirement income. In fact, here's just one little example. It's not even just about cash. In Austria, women who get maternity benefit, if they're self-employed, the social insurance system will provide them with an assistant to help their business while they're on maternity leave. That shows the extent of what social insurance can do to mobilize assistance for people, and it's not always just a cash benefit. There's problems with social insurance, though. We all know it's creating an industrial culture, and with the rise of women coming into the system and the fragmentation of work contracts and working time, it's come under pressure. Social insurance, of course, benefits those who work. Okay, that's about 60% of people in the economy, 60, 65%. But it leaves a lot of people out, and a lot of people don't get the benefits if they're part-time or casual workers, etc. And attempts to address this by many countries has just increased the bureaucracy and the complexity of systems. But nonetheless, it provides a very strong social net for people. But nonetheless, it would be extremely expensive to introduce, and therefore it needs a supporting thing. And that's why I suggest that basic income has that capacity. A reduced working week and a higher social wage holds out the similar promise. But they cannot, I don't think, realize it on their own. It needs basic income. For a reducing week, it can create compensation flexibility. And for social insurance, it could limit the amount of costs, because social insurance would not cover the whole expense, but just be a top-up to basic income. However, if basic income would help make a reduced working week and higher social wage feasible, how do we make basic income feasible? I'm going to be very brief on that. I'm not going to go into all the stuff about the fiscal space. Everybody's sick of the fiscal space, but I can tell you this, the fiscal space, it may sound like a lot over the next 5 years. It ain't much at all when you factor in inflation and age demographics. We have a very limited fiscal space. If we want more money, we're going to have to increase taxes, which is going against the grain of the current government. There's also the need for higher investment in our economic infrastructure. So I think that the words of Reed and Lansley are well taken. To reach a compromise between the affordability of the scheme and a rate of payment that is big enough to make a non-trivial impact on income distribution. So here's a very simple proposal, starting proposal. We take all the personal tax credits and we convert them into a basic income payment. You take the single, married, PAYA, and the new self-employed contracts and turn them into a direct payment to all adults. This would start a basic income of between 60 and 65 euros a week. It would not impact on anybody who's currently in the income tax, fully in the income tax threshold, because all you're doing is converting what they get already, a personal tax credit, into a direct payment. It may not affect anybody on social protection. That depends how you introduce it, because you would just deduct that, you would just factor that in to the social protection payment. What it would do immediately is, and very much like Michelle was talking about, a tax refundable tax credit there. It would actually benefit those under the threshold. The low paid, the part-timers, the casual workers, the precarious workers. It would actually be a major boost to hundreds of thousands of people in the system. They would immediately feel the increase. Here's just a very quick calculation. Average earner, no net gain, because the direct payment cancels out the loss of credits. For the low paid, somebody on 12,000, be 700 euros a year, and somebody who's maybe a casual worker, 26 weeks at minimum wage, it'd be over 1,400 euros. But we also have other wider benefits than just that, and I'm coming to the conclusion. For instance, take students and means testing. The means testing for maintenance grants for students is incredibly low. If a household earns more than 40,000 euros, they're ineligible for a full-time maintenance grant. 40,000. That's two people working on less than the living wage, and they're means tested out of a maintenance grant. If you make 46,000, you can't even get a part-time maintenance grant. That's two people working on the living wage, and they're outside of that. If, however, you were to take this and pay this personal tax credit of 3,300 euro a year to students, you would actually be above the maintenance grants levels. You could actually abolish the maintenance grant system except for one special category. So you would recoup that fund, and everybody all students would get this amount. How much time?
You're okay.
Yeah. Two more things. Lone parents have a tax credit which is above the current tax credit, above the normal tax credits. Everybody gets PAYE, and personal allowances. They get an additional one if they're in work. If, however, a single parent is not in work and on social protection, they don't get anything extra. If you turn that into a basic payment, that means all single parents, regardless of whether they're in work or not in work, would get that payment, easing the transition between working or falling back, not into working or whatever, because so many single parents have precarious or periodic things, and it would equalize the treatment. Same thing, do we have a blind person's tax credit? Again, over and above that, but if you happen to be blind and on social protection, you don't get any extra money because you're blind. Just turn it into a basic payment. Just convert the thing into a basic payment, treat all people the same, and that could be the basis. That could actually be the basis of a cost of disability payment, which disability campaigners have been talking about. Just nearing the end, the cost. Oh, geez, I've tried looking at doing back of the Excel sheet calculations. Revenue Commissioner's data suggests it would cost somewhere in the region of 1.5, possibly 2 billion euros. But researchers from Social Justice Ireland, when they were doing their own research into the refundable tax credit, suggest that it would be a lot lower. And I believe it would be, because there's a lot of stuff in the Revenue Commissioner's data which you would have to extrapolate out. By the way, if it was even 1 billion euros it cost, that is far less than what the government intends to cut in terms of taxation over the next 4 years. Over the next 4 years, they intend to cut 2.5 billion. Why not introduce this, bring that benefit in, and then get rid of the tax cuts, and you got an extra 1.5 billion to support health, education, and investment. Seems like a good deal. Therefore, it should be a goal, I think, of researchers to actually cost a partial basic income, whether on this model or on the model that Michelle did, with the full costings and knock-on implications for other programs, and might even be helpful if that could be run through the ESRI switch program to get an assessment of the impact on income distribution to see what the winners and losers are. So this is really about getting the dots to work for each other. For instance, I just say this, just because you support basic income, it doesn't mean you have to support social insurance or reduced working week. Same thing if you support reduced working week, doesn't, you're not asking people to buy in. For instance, I support social insurance. I don't care anything about basic income except that it helps promote social insurance. So therefore, it's a good idea. I support reduced working week. I'm not interested in all that kind of solidarity and all that. I just want a reduced working week. Basic income helps that position. Now, you may say, oh, geez, that's very utilitarian. Well, welcome to politics. However, I actually don't think it's that way. Because I do think that the people who support these type of things are supporting an emancipatory narrative. Each one of these things speaks to a better way of living. More time for yourself, more security in times of contingency, and a framework, a net, that means no one falls through. Now, it's not suggesting that, that all of a sudden you have to kind of do everything together, but to actually be aware that these are how these things interact, even if only tangentially. And if we do that, we may find not only are we capable of achieving our goals, but find new opportunities, new solutions. And in conclusion, like always, it's an old trading maxim. It's better to work together on these things than to work separate. It's better to work in a very broad alliance. And the reason we do that is not to create a perfect system. Lord, save us from perfect systems, those elegant algorithms which define our lives to the 27th decimal. No, give me something a little messier, full of compromises, but which means it's a better system, a better system. That's what we should be striving for. That's how we can vindicate people's ordinary inspirations today into something better tomorrow. Thank you.
And I have no doubt that we have a few questions after that presentation. Yes, somebody here, first of all. Might take a couple of them together if we could. Anybody else interested there? So I'll come to you after.
Thank you very much. My name is Sinead Mercier, and I'm a researcher for the Green Party. I forgot to say that earlier, my question on open borders, so sorry. My question for Michael Taft is, how do you envisage the enforcement of basic income, especially with the way the social welfare system is going with increasing privatisation and the fact that we've seen record numbers of people being cut off social welfare? And also in terms of the fact that private systems under international human rights law, when it comes to implementing economic and social and cultural rights, it's generally a state-focused system. So how can human rights law or other constitutional strategies work in this framework of privatisation? And secondly, my question is as well, my parents are artists and they often do work which is underpaid, undervalued and invisible. and how would basic income support that structure if it's consistently focusing only on more general types of kind of the types of work which would be like for civil servants or private sector? Thank you.
Just to check if there's anyone else before Michael addresses. Yes, somebody over here.
Thanks. I'm Anne-Marie McGoran from the National Economic and Social Council. I was interested in what you said about reducing work to a 30-hour week. Well, I'm sure some people would love to have a 30-hour week rather than a 10-hour or an 8-hour week. But you said it would be economically very challenging. So I was wondering, how was the reduction from 60 hours to 40 hours brought down without it becoming economically very challenging? And also, if a 30-hour week meant reduced output, like how much would that actually matter given the amount of stuff we have that we don't need? That may be very simplistic, but just, you know, would it matter a lot? Thanks.
Thanks for that. Michael, go ahead.
Just on the first question, how is it compatible with privatization? Well, I thought it wouldn't be. How in the world can you privatize the provision of social protection and assume that it will actually keep the word social in it? The very nature of privatization is to commodify, is to put a market price on something. And that is not what social protection is about. Now, there's all sorts of squeeze on resources. Those are issues we have to discuss, but those are political issues. Once you privatize something, you actually start to marketize the system. In terms of, say, your parents who are artists, I just say this, the basic income element is for everybody. I argue for the social insurance in terms of the benefits it can give under its own regime. By the way, social insurance is malleable. It can actually include more and more people. For instance, on the EU, in many EU countries, most EU countries, in fact, self-employed are fully integrated into the social insurance model, or as fully integrated as possible. Here there's still a debate. So you can actually produce, over time, parents, usually the mother, who takes time off a year or 2 or 3 to care for their child, they now can get credits. Before they couldn't. So that was a disadvantage. So you can use credits, you can extend it to part-time and all that. But where that fails, you have the safety net of basic income. How did they reduce it from 60 hours to 40 hours? There's a number of factors. One, productivity. Quite simply, machines started doing things better in 1890 than they did in 1860, and then in 1920. By the way, it took about 50 years before the 40-hour work week kind of became established as a general rule. Now, there's still people working much longer. Secondly, people were in trade unions. I mean, okay, you'd say, well, you'd say that because you're a trade unionist, but that's just true. They bargained. And here's the thing, and this is the same thing, say, with social insurance, the social wage, increasing employer social insurance. There's many ways you can bargain. You can bargain for a wage increase. You can bargain okay, well, we won't make much of a wage increase, but we want a sick pay program or an improvement to the sick pay program. Pension at the firm level, pensions is a constant element for bargaining. So you can integrate that. You can also bargain, possibly not at firm level, but you can bargain at sectoral or national level. If we had sectoral and national bargaining, like most other countries, that's another debate. So that could become part of the bargaining process. But at the end of the day, it seemed reasonable. Businesses need people to buy their goods and services. If you've been working 60 hours a week, when the hell are you going to have time to go out and buy any goods and services? It can be quite simple as that. That actually the market economy needs healthy consumers just as it needs healthy workers. And so we're starting to see that in the debates about, health in the workplace, lifestyle balance, and all that.